A detective's fight against crime.
Chapter 1. Detective John Smith sat at his desk, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. The case had been open for weeks and he was no closer to finding the perpetrator. The victim, a young woman named Emily, had been found beaten and strangled in an alleyway near her home. Despite the efforts of the entire department, they had yet to find any leads or suspects. John couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. He had pored over the evidence again and again, but nothing seemed to connect. He had even brought in a forensic team to comb the crime scene, but they had come up empty-handed. Just as he was about to call it a day, a call came in from one of the local businesses. They had found a discarded cell phone near their dumpster and thought it might be related to the case. John thanked the caller and rushed to the scene. As he examined the phone, he noticed that it had been wiped clean of any data. But the serial number matched that of the phone belonging to Emily. John knew this was their break. He could finally get a lead on this case. He immediately put out a call for any known associates of Emily to come in for questioning. But as he sat and waited for his suspects to arrive, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. He knew that this case was far from over and that he still had a lot of work to do. He couldn't rest until the perpetrator was brought to justice and the victim's family had closure. Chapter 2. As the day progressed, John's team brought in several people for questioning. But none of them seemed to have any connection to the crime. John couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the truth, but he just couldn't put his finger on it. He decided to take a break and headed out to grab a cup of coffee. As he walked down the street, he passed by a store window and caught a glimpse of his reflection. Suddenly, he remembered something that had been nagging at the back of his mind for days. He rushed back to the station and pulled out the CCTV footage from the night of the murder. He fast-forwarded through the footage until he saw a figure walking down the alleyway where Emily's body was found. The figure was wearing a hood and had their face obscured, but John could see something in their gait that seemed familiar. He called in his team and they huddled around the screen, watching the footage in silence. As the figure passed by the camera, they turned their heads slightly and John saw a glimpse of their face. It was Emily's ex-boyfriend, who they had previously cleared of suspicion. John immediately put out an APB for the ex-boyfriend and within hours, they had him in custody. As they interrogated him, he broke down and confessed to the murder. He claimed that he couldn't handle the fact that she had moved on and he couldn't live without her. With the perpetrator in custody and the case finally solved, John felt a sense of satisfaction and closure. But he knew that for the victim's family, the pain would never truly go away. Chapter 3. As the trial began, the evidence against Emily's ex-boyfriend was overwhelming. His DNA was found at the crime scene, and his confession was recorded. The prosecution painted him as a jealous and possessive man who couldn't handle the fact that Emily had moved on. The defense tried to argue that he had acted in a moment of passion and didn't intend to kill her, but the jury wasn't convinced. After a week-long trial, the jury found him guilty of murder in the first degree. The ex-boyfriend was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read out the verdict, Emily's family sat in the courtroom, tears streaming down their faces. They finally had justice for their loved one. John sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as the ex-boyfriend was led away in handcuffs. He couldn't help but think about the senselessness of it all. Emily's life was cut short because of one man's jealousy and possessiveness. As he left the courthouse, he couldn't help but think about all the other families out there who were still searching for closure and justice for their loved ones. He knew that this was just one small victory in the fight against crime, and that there were still so many more battles to be fought. Chapter 4. After the trial, John found himself struggling to move on from the case. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's beaten and strangled body from his mind. He felt a sense of responsibility for her death, even though he knew it wasn't his fault. He knew that he had done everything in his power to bring her killer to justice, but it wasn't enough to ease his guilt. He tried to immerse himself in work, taking on more cases and working longer hours, but it didn't help. He found himself becoming increasingly distant from his family and friends. And he knew that something had to change. One day, John decided to visit Emily's family. He knew that they would never fully heal from the loss of their daughter. But he hoped that by bringing her killer to justice, he had at least provided them with a sense of closure. When he arrived at their house, they welcomed him with open arms. They told him how grateful they were for his hard work and dedication to the case. They shared stories of Emily with him and showed him pictures of her as a child. As he sat in their living room surrounded by her family, John finally felt a sense of peace. He realized that while he couldn't bring Emily back, he had helped her family find closure and gave them a sense of justice. He knew that was the best he could do as a detective. John left the family's home feeling a sense of renewed purpose. He knew that he would continue to fight for justice for victims and their families, and that this case will always be a reminder for him of the importance of that fight. Chapter 5. John's visit to Emily's family had a profound impact on him. He felt more motivated than ever to continue fighting for justice for victims and their families. He couldn't bring back the dead, but he could ensure that their killers were brought to justice and that their families had closure. In the months that followed, John threw himself into his work. He took on more cases and worked tirelessly to solve them. He had a renewed sense of purpose, and it showed in the results he was getting. One day, while working on a new case, John received a phone call from Emily's mother. She thanked him again for all his hard work and told him that they had set up a scholarship in Emily's name at the local college. John was touched by the gesture, and knew that it was a fitting tribute to Emily's memory. He felt proud to have played a small part in making sure that her legacy lived on. As he hung up the phone, John knew that he would never forget the case, or the young woman whose life was taken too soon. He would always remember the importance of fighting for justice, and the impact it could have on the lives of victims and their families. John continued to work hard as a detective, and was determined to make a difference in the fight against crime. He knew that every case mattered, and he was dedicated to seeing each one through to the end, no matter what it takes. Chapter 6. As years passed, John climbed up the ranks in the police department. His reputation as a relentless and dedicated detective had spread far and wide, and he was frequently sought out to lead high-profile cases. One such case was the investigation of a string of burglaries in the city. The thief had been targeting high-end jewelry stores and had evaded capture for months. It was a case that stumped the department, but John was determined to catch the perpetrator. He spent countless hours poring over surveillance footage, chasing leads, and interviewing potential suspects. He was determined to bring this criminal to justice and put a stop to the string of burglaries. As he dug deeper into the case, John realized that they were dealing with a professional thief who had left no trace behind. He knew that it would be a tough case to crack, but he was determined not to give up. He set up a task force consisting of some of the best detectives in the department, and they worked tirelessly to crack the case. They chased down leads, followed up on tips, and interviewed witnesses. Finally, after months of tireless work, they got a break in the case. They were able to gather enough evidence to identify and arrest the thief. It was a huge victory for John and his team, and they were hailed as heroes by the community. John felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that they had brought a criminal to justice and made the city a safer place for everyone. He knew that the fight against crime was never ending, but he was determined to keep doing his part to keep the community safe. Chapter 7. As John continued to work on cases, he also made a point to stay connected to Emily's family. Checking in on them and keeping them updated on any developments in the department that might be of interest to them. He felt a sense of responsibility towards them, and he wanted to make sure they knew that they could always count on him. John's reputation as a skilled and dedicated detective continued to grow, and he was soon promoted to the rank of detective sergeant. He was now in charge of his own team of detectives, and he was determined to lead by example. John's team worked on several high-profile cases over the years, and they had a string of successes. They were able to solve murders, bring down drug rings, and put away criminals who had been terrorizing the community. Through it all, John never lost sight of the importance of the work they were doing. He knew that every case mattered, and that every victim and their family deserved justice. He made sure that his team understood this as well, and he instilled in them a sense of purpose and dedication to the work they were doing. As John grew older, he knew that it was time for him to think about retirement. But he couldn't bring himself to leave the force. He couldn't imagine doing anything else. He loved the work that he did, and he knew that he could make a difference. So, he decided to stay on as a consultant and mentor to the new generation of detectives, passing on his knowledge and experience to ensure that the fight against crime would continue. Chapter 8. John's decision to stay on as a consultant was met with enthusiasm from the department. He quickly became a valued member of the team, and his experience and knowledge proved to be invaluable. He was sought after for advice on difficult cases, and his insights often proved to be the key to solving them. As John worked alongside the new generation of detectives, he couldn't help but be impressed by their dedication and passion for the work. They reminded him of himself when he was starting out, and he was proud to be able to pass on the lessons he had learned over the years. One day, John was approached by a young detective who was struggling with a particularly difficult case. It was a murder case, and the detective was finding it hard to find any leads or suspects. John remembered how he felt when he was starting out, and he knew how hard it could be to crack a case when you're feeling stuck. John sat down with the detective and they went over the case together. He listened as the detective shared their thoughts and theories, and he offered his own insights. As they worked through the case, John could see the young detective's confidence growing. Finally, they were able to identify a suspect and gather enough evidence to make an arrest. The detective was ecstatic, and they thanked John profusely for his help. John felt a sense of pride, knowing that he had been able to make a difference in this young detective's career. As he looked back on his years of service, John knew that he had made a difference in the fight against crime. He had helped to bring closure to victims' families, and he had helped to make the community a safer place. He knew that he had left a lasting legacy, and he was content knowing that the fight against crime would continue long after he was gone.